Hey everybody, and welcome to the Master Level Marriage Podcast, where we discuss all things marriage and where you can discover the tools that you need to have a strong and healthy relationship. Our host, author, and marriage coach, Dr. Ronnie Gaines, will unpack many facets of a marital relationship as he dives into the dynamics of a marriage. In each episode, you will learn what it takes to succeed in your relationship and win in your marriage. Whether you are in the planning stages or have been married for several years, our desire is to help you grow and enrich your life as a couple and become a success story. Subscribe or follow us and be notified of each episode. Please leave us a review and help us help other couples. For more information, visit www.masterlevelmarriage.com. Thanks for checking us out. Now here's your host, Dr. Ronnie Gaines.
Welcome to the Master Level Marriage Podcast. I'm your host, Ronnie Gaines, and I'm so glad that you are with me on this show today. Hey, I've got a good one for you. But before we get started, I want to say thank you so much for those of you who are downloading the podcast, downloading the shows, watching it via YouTube channel. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for just hanging out with me and learning some things about our marriage, which I believe will ultimately change everything and increase your ability to bring health to your relationship. That's what it's about. It's not about trying to keep from never arguing again, but it's about bringing health, learning how to do the things correctly to bring health. And so thank you for being a part of this show, and especially today as we dive into this show talking about Dr. John Gottman's 5-to-1 ratio, positive to negative interactions. These positive to negative interactions in our relationship, in our marriage. And so what he states is that for every marriage, there are positive interactions and there's negative interactions. Listen, I don't know about you, but I believe that we can't completely get away from some negative interactions, some negative behaviors. It's going to happen. You're not going to completely get away from negative behaviors. Sometimes we just are having a bad day. And sometimes those bad days lead to negative emotions, negative behaviors, causes problems. But I believe that just as he states that there should be in a good relationship, in a great relationship, there should be a 5-to-1 positive to negative interactions. Positive to negative. And he has this idea that there are masters in their marriage, and there are also disasters. And I love how he came up with this idea. John Gottman, being a psychologist and expert in marriage, years ago created what he called love labs. And in these love labs, they were little apartments that he created for couples who would go into these labs, and they would live there, and they would be monitored. They would have data on how they interacted with each other. And in this lab, although these cameras were set all over most every room, they were just above eye level. And as these couples would come in and they would live in these apartments, they knew the cameras were there. And even though they knew the cameras were there, they would always fall into a normal married relationship, even though they knew they were being watched and recorded. Not only did they have cameras, but they also had some monitors where they tracked heart rate and they tracked blood pressure. They wanted a full data records that would indicate when these individuals would come under some kind of negative response or negative interaction, and see what would happen in their bodies and in their minds and their lives, and they'd see what kind of stress they would be under. So they would go into these love labs and they would interact, live daily lives. Just as I stated, even though they knew they were They were strapped on with monitors to track them, cameras to view them. They still fell into the normal married life. Well, what he came to the conclusion through all these studies and many hours of watching couples, coming up with all the data, he found that there were two sets, or we should say two different categories of couples. One of them was the masters, and the other one was the disasters. And as he watched their interactions with each other, there was something that was confusing about why some got through a lot of the interactions, even if it was negative, even if they were in conflict. Some would get through these interactions and get past them and move on and had master's lives, had master sort of relationships, but some of them were just disasters. And they just seemed to not be able to get through the negative behaviors and negative interactions. And so he began to look and see what it was that caused some to be masters and some to be disasters. They had the same problems. They all went through the same thing. Marriage is marriage, although I understand that there's some marriages that have different dynamics and different things that might cause problems or arguments or whatever it may be, conflict. But for the most part, even though the conflicts might be a little bit different, all marriages just seem to be the same. They would fight, they would argue, they would get into conflict, but there was something different about the masters versus the disasters. And what he found was that the masters had an ability, even through negativity, through conflict, through problems, they had the ability to have about 5 positive interactions to 1 negative. Or you could say it like this: there was about 1 negative interaction for every 5 positive. And it put them at the top of the list as being masters. When it came to the disasters, what he found out was this: that they had sometimes about 1-to-1. That there was about 1 positive to 1 negative. And it just kept their lives in turmoil and conflict, fighting, getting at each other, living a life of terror, living a marriage life that just is not enjoyable. So he began to do some work toward couples who were living this life of this 1-to-1 ratio, this life of a disaster, and he began to study them even more. But he also looked at those masters to see how they did what they did to maintain a healthy marriage. He come to the conclusion that, listen, sometimes we're going to have negativity, but your marriage and your life can only handle so much negativity before it starts falling apart. You can only stay in so much negativity before you've had enough. And you may be out there today thinking, well, there's so much negativity in my relationship, I just don't know how much more I can handle. I don't know how much more I can take. And that's a really tough place to be, but I want to help you today. If you're that couple that you think you're the masters and every now and then there's something negative pops up, but you turn everything around and make it more positive, then this is for you as well, because I can give you some things that I believe will help it even more. And one of those things is this: as couples, we make bids to each other. How many times have you seen your spouse come in and you can kind of see that look on their face, or you kind of see that behavior of of some kind of negative behavior when they walk in. They seem upset, they seem annoyed, and so you say these little things or do these little things that puts out a bid to see what they'll do when the bid is placed in front of them. Maybe you put a bid out, maybe kind of a little joke that you may put out there just to see their response. And sometimes bids are put out there to see if what you're experiencing from them or you see in them, we put out the bids to see if maybe that frustration or that aggravation is aimed at us rather than some external thing that might be causing it. You know, we put out these bids sometimes too to maybe bring about some attributions, if you will, or explanations. Because if they act one way, we want to explain that maybe as it's something else outside of us, or explain it. Well, why are you upset at me? But we put these bids to see the interaction or just see the reaction of the person who might be looking frustrated or aggravated in some way. So we put out bids. And by putting out these bids, we want to know, is it me or is it something else? We put out bids in other ways too. I know I've heard people talk about putting out bids to see what mood their wife is in. Some guys put out bids to see what mood their wife may be in before they maybe spring something on her on something they're getting ready to purchase or whatever. Make sure she's in a good mood before I spring this new toy that we're getting ready to purchase, or maybe see what kind of mood they're in before we ask them about a certain thing. But we put out bids. And however we react to these bids really determines whether it's a negative or positive. You know, we can put out bids and still get positive responses, even if we are in conflict. And that's what the masters do. Even if they're in conflict and they're not having a good day, maybe they're in some kind of argument, they still react in a positive way. We don't always have to react in a negative way just because we're upset, just because we're aggravated with our spouse. Maybe we're mad at them. Maybe they did something, said something, and we're still kind of ticked off over that. But when they make that bid, the masters have learned how to have a positive reaction rather than negative. And again, we can only handle so much negativity. But what these studies had shown was that the disasters, everything was almost everything was negative in some way. Whether they were in a good mood, bad mood, in conflict or out of conflict, there was always these little things that they always did that was negative. And it really drives a relationship into a place of question and could cause some kind of failure in the relationship. In fact, Dr. John Gottman, he states that he can watch a couple interact with each other. They can be in a room, sitting, counseling, watching them, and within 15 minutes, he could determine whether that couple is going to stay together or at some point a possible divorce or some kind of failure in the relationship. And it has a lot to do with their positive and their negative interactions with each other, how they influence each other, how they talk to each other. If one says something the other one doesn't agree with, do they respond negatively? He can watch them. And I believe that. I believe that there is a way, and I've seen some couples that come into my office that maybe I didn't figure it out in 15 minutes, but I've watched them sit in my office. I just had a couple here recently that I saw, and as soon as they sat down and I asked them this question or gave them this statement, I said, "Tell me your story. and what got you here today. Within about 20 minutes, I was already determining that there was so much negativity in this relationship that I'm wondering whether it's going to fail or whether we can give them some kind of hope and some kind of strategy to turn this relationship into a positive relationship. I think we can, and I think that they do want to work towards that. But within 15 or 20 minutes, I saw the problem. So it's really trying to work through these positive and these negative responses and making sure. Now, I know that we can't go through this relationship and just try to keep track of a ratio of 5-1. But we just need to ensure that most of our interactions and our behaviors are positive versus negative. Now, one of the things that I instruct clients with on this positive versus negative interactions is I believe there's 3 ways that we can react when we are presented with a bid. And I use this example for in so many different settings. And let's just say that you and your spouse are headed on a trip, and on your way out of town, you guys just got into an argument when you left the house, and you're not really speaking to each other. In fact, you're both pretty ticked off at this point, but you're leaving out of town in the vehicle and driving. You're not speaking to each other, but the wife wants to give a bid to see how he's going to react to her comment. And it matters how he reacts, because she's putting out a bid and she wants to see if he's going to react in a positive or a negative way. Now, if their marriage has been good and they've been working on their positive and negative ratio and keeping it in a positive side, then he could probably get by with maybe one negative here. But she puts out a bid, and they're driving out of town, and she looks over and she sees this house that they drive by almost every day. Beautiful home, white picket fence, beautiful yard, beautiful landscape, beautiful home. And she makes this comment. She said, "Oh, I'd love to have a house like that." Well, that's a bid, because she's not really talking to him. He's not really talking to her. They're both upset. And she really is not really saying it to him, but she's putting out a bid to see what he will do. She's basically just saying it. Now, there's 3 things that he has the ability to do right here. 2 of these things are going to be negative, and 1 will be positive. The first thing that he could do is he could turn away. Now, what that means is if she makes that bid and says, "Oh, I'd love to live in a house. I'd love to have a house like that," his turning away could simply be that he just doesn't say anything. He's just silent. Just looks ahead as he's driving. She might cut her eyes just barely over at him to see what he's doing. He's not making any certain expression. He's just driving. That could be turning away. Not saying anything is actually a negative. You think, you might say, well, that's not a bad thing, but that is negative because she's put a bid out and he says nothing. That's turning away. Now, the second thing that he could do, which is also a negative, she says, "Oh, I'd love to live in a house like that. I'd love to have a house like that." If he turned against, which is the second thing, he would say something like this: "All you ever do is think about something different. You're never satisfied with what you have." Now he's turned against her. And that's a big negative. She put out the bid, he turned against. But I'm going to tell you that those 2, now, mostly the one that's maybe turning away where he doesn't say anything, that could be the masters that's just upset and maybe having one negative. The one that turns against is usually the disasters. But let me show you what a master level marriage does. The masters in the marriage, they don't turn away, they don't turn against, but they will turn toward. They may be upset. They still may be upset. They may be frustrated. They may be in an argument, and they may not even say anything the rest of the trip. But when she says, man, I would love to live in a house like that, all he does is he says, yeah, that would be nice. And he never looked at her. He kept looking straight ahead. Nothing else was said. She put out the bid, and he said, yeah, that would be nice. He turned toward her. That was a positive interaction. Doesn't mean that the conflict is settled. Doesn't mean that they're still not frustrated. But this is what the masters do. The masters will primarily 5 times positive and 1 time negative, 5 times they will turn toward their mate. They'll turn toward their spouse. And every now and then they'll have out of 5 positive, they'll have 1 negative. You know, if we could just get this right, if we could just stay on the ratio of 5-to-1 positive to negative interaction, this will ultimately change your relationship. Think about that. It really is being intentional. Because sometimes when we are when we are frustrated, when we are in conflict, it's very difficult to think positively. But all we have to do is get in the habit and the practice of being positive. And when you stay positive, listen, I promise you, you can be positive and still be upset. You don't have to be negative just because you're upset, but turn toward each other instead of away or against. And I promise you, your relationship will be a master's level relationship. Come on, let's do this today. Let's change the way we speak to each other. Let's change the way we act towards each other. Let's change our lives today and be those that John Gottman calls the masters. You can be a master in your relationship. Let's do this today and be positive, 5-to-1 over 1 negative. And know this, that if you have a 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio of interactions, you will have a master level marriage. I hope you've enjoyed this today. Take this, run with it today. Teach it to your spouse. Talk about it. Make it happen. Be intentional. And when you're intentional, things will come together. Thank you for being a part of this show today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Be ready for the next show just coming up in 1 week. And we will be talking again about those things that will bring health to your relationship. And I always want to leave you with this. Be your best self. Live out your full potential and experience your best marriage. I'll see you on the next episode.